While I was in the hospital for half a year after a car accident, my wife forged documents to declare me legally incompetent and take my home and all my savings. But she didn't expect that all this time I knew about it and was ready. So here I am, 37 years old, and let me tell you about the night that completely flipped my world upside down. The name's Michael, and up until that point, I thought I had life pretty much figured out. I was working as a mechanic at this small auto shop in Phoenix, nothing fancy, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. I'd been married to Sarah for 8 years, and we had this comfortable routine going. You know how it is: wake up, grab coffee, head to work, come home at dinner, and maybe catch some TV. Nothing spectacular, but it was ours, and I was content with it. That Tuesday night started like any other. I'd stayed late at the shop working on Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick. The transmission was giving her trouble, and she couldn't afford to take it to one of those fancy dealerships downtown. I always had a soft spot for folks like her, retirees on fixed incomes who just needed their car to get to the grocery store and doctor appointments. By the time I finished up, it was almost 11 p.m. I remember texting Sarah that I was heading home and to save me some of that leftover meatloaf. She texted back with one of those eye-rolling emojis and told me to drive safe. If I'd known that would be our last normal conversation, I would have called instead. The drive home was typical Arizona desert quiet. Empty roads, scattered streetlights, and that dry heat that never really goes away, even at night. I had my windows down in my old Ford pickup, listening to some classic rock station, when I saw these headlights coming at me way too fast. Now, I've been driving for over 20 years, and you develop this sixth sense about when something's not right. These headlights were weaving, crossing the center line, then jerking back. My first thought was that some kid was texting and driving, but then I realized they were coming straight at me. I had maybe 3 seconds to react. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, try and get onto the shoulder, but this drunk idiot, and yeah, we found out later he was 3 times over the legal limit. He followed my movement like he was locked onto me. It was like something out of a nightmare. The impact happened so fast, but felt like it lasted forever. 1 second I'm gripping the steering wheel. The next I'm hearing this horrible sound of metal crunching and glass exploding. My truck flipped twice, and I remember thinking, real clear like, that this was how I was going to die. Not from old age or some disease, but because some selfish drunk couldn't call an Uber. When everything stopped moving, I was hanging upside down in my seatbelt. The taste of blood was thick in my mouth, and every breath felt like someone was stabbing me in the chest. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer, and I kept trying to move my legs, but nothing was happening down there. The paramedics later told me I was conscious when they found me, asking about the other driver. Turns out he walked away with just a few scratches. Isn't that always how it goes? The drunk walks away while the innocent person gets destroyed. Life's got a twisted sense of humor sometimes. At the hospital, everything became this blur of bright lights. People in scrubs talking in medical terms I didn't understand, and machines beeping everywhere. Sarah showed up about an hour after they brought me in, and I could see the shock in her eyes when she saw me all banged up. The doctor, this tall guy with gray hair who looked like he'd delivered bad news before, pulled Sarah aside while I was drifting in and out of consciousness. I caught bits and pieces: multiple fractures in both legs, cracked pelvis, broken ribs, punctured lung. The words that stuck with me were when he said I was lucky to be alive. Those first few days were rough. Pain medication kept me floating in this weird space where I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. Sarah was there every day at first, holding my hand, bringing me magazines and those terrible hospital snacks from the vending machine. But something started changing after the first week. Maybe I was just paranoid from all the drugs, but Sarah seemed different. She'd check her phone more often, step out to take calls, and when she thought I was sleeping, I caught her having these whispered conversations in the hallway. The breaking point came about 2 weeks in. I'd just had surgery to put some pins in my leg, and I woke up around midnight feeling like my throat was on fire. Sarah was sitting in the visitor chair, talking quietly on her phone, probably thinking I was knocked out cold from the anesthesia. That's when I heard her say those words that changed everything. She was telling someone that I probably wouldn't walk again, and that she'd handle everything soon. The way she said it, so casual and matter-of-fact, made my blood run cold. This wasn't my wife talking about medical concerns. This was someone making plans. The next morning, when the nurse came in to adjust my floor, she asked me quietly if I had any other family members she could contact. When I asked why, she hesitated before telling me that Sarah had been asking a lot of questions about insurance policies and property deeds. She said it in that careful way medical professionals use when they're trying to warn you about something without getting too involved. 4 months of hell later, I was finally getting discharged from the hospital. 4 months of physical therapy, learning to walk again with crutches, and dealing with insurance companies who acted like paying my medical bills was some personal favor they were doing me. But hey, at least I had one piece of good news. My lawyer had managed to squeeze $500,000 out of the drunk driver's insurance company. $500,000. That's what my shattered legs, broken ribs, and months of agony were apparently worth. The lawyer took his cut, of course, but it was still enough money to set Sarah and me up pretty comfortably. I kept thinking about how we could finally pay off the house, maybe take that vacation to Hawaii she'd always wanted. I'll never forget standing on those crutches outside the hospital, breathing real air for the first time in months. The Arizona sun felt amazing on my face, and for a brief moment, I actually felt optimistic about getting my life back on track. Sarah had promised to pick me up, but when she didn't show, I figured she was just running late from work. After waiting an hour, I called an Uber. The driver, this friendly, older Hispanic guy, helped me get my crutches and the small bag of personal items into his car. We made small talk about the weather and sports, normal stuff that felt incredible after months of only talking to doctors and nurses. When we pulled up to my house, I felt this wave of emotion hit me. Home, my little slice of suburban Phoenix with the desert landscaping Sarah had insisted on because it was water efficient. The palm tree I had planted for our 5th anniversary was still there, looking a bit taller than I remembered. I hobbled up to the front door and pressed the doorbell, expecting Sarah to come running with tears in her eyes, ready to welcome her recovering husband home. Instead, the door opened to reveal some guy I'd never seen before, tall, probably his 40s, wearing a tank top that showed off arms covered in tattoos. This stranger looked me up and down like I was a door-to-door salesman bothering him during his afternoon nap. He asked who I was and what I wanted, like I was trespassing on my own property. When I explained that this was my house and I was looking for my wife, Sarah, his expression shifted to something between confusion and annoyance. Turns out Sarah had been renting out our house to this guy, let's call him Tank Top Tony, for the past 2 months. She'd apparently moved in with her friend across town and was collecting rent money from our home while I was laid up in the hospital. Tony seemed genuinely surprised that I existed and kept apologizing, saying Sarah told him her husband had died in an accident. Died. She'd told people I was dead. While I was fighting every day just to walk again, she was already playing the grieving widow and cash in on my supposed demise. The betrayal hit me harder than that drunk driver's car ever could have. Tony, who turned out to be a decent guy caught in the middle of my wife's lies, led me into my own house to grab some documents. Walking through those familiar rooms felt surreal. Everything looked the same but felt completely foreign, like visiting a museum of your own life. That's when I found a manila envelope on the kitchen counter, the one that would make everything crystal clear. Inside were real estate documents, papers to sell the house, and there at the bottom was my signature. Except I'd never signed anything. I was unconscious in intensive care when those papers were supposedly signed. My hands were shaking as I stared at that forged signature. It looked pretty good. I'll give her credit for that. She'd obviously practiced. But I knew my own handwriting, and this wasn't it. The M in Michael was too sharp, and I always made this little loop in my last name that wasn't there. I called Sarah right there from the kitchen, using the same phone where we planned weekend barbecues and argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash. When she answered, her voice had this strange, flat quality, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. She explained it all so matter-of-factly it was almost impressive. She needed to move on with her life. She didn't think I'd ever fully recover. The house payments were too much for her to handle alone. She'd found someone who could take care of her properly. Each excuse hit like a punch to the gut. When I confronted her about the forged signature, there was this long pause on the line. Then she said something that still haunts me. She claimed I had given her power of attorney, while I was on heavy pain medication. It was her word against mine, and who's going to believe a guy with a traumatic brain injury over a grieving wife just trying to survive? Except I didn't have a traumatic brain injury. My head was fine, it was my legs that got messed up. But Sarah was betting that people wouldn't ask too many questions about the details. She was counting on sympathy and assumptions to cover her tracks while she systematically dismantled the life we'd built together. After I hung up, I sat in my own kitchen feeling like a stranger in my own life. Tony brought me a beer from my own refrigerator and sat down across from me with this uncomfortable expression. He'd obviously figured out that he'd been living in a house that didn't legally belong to his landlord. The next morning, I was on the phone with a lawyer before most people had their first cup of coffee. I'd found this attorney, Jim Kowalski, through Google reviews. Apparently, he specialized in fraud cases and had a reputation for being a real pit bull in court. Plus, his name sounded Polish, and my grandfather always told me to trust Polish people because they know how to fight. Jim's office was in one of those strip malls that scream lawyer who actually works for regular people instead of corporations. The waiting room had outdated magazines and a coffee machine that looked like it belonged in a gas station, but Jim himself was sharp as a tack. He took one look at the forged documents and started chuckling. Apparently, Sarah had made several amateur mistakes. The pen ink didn't match the date on the documents. The signature was too perfect. Most people's signatures vary slightly each time they sign. And best of all, the notary stamp was from a guy who'd been out of town the day I supposedly signed the papers. Jim called it a rookie fraud job and seemed genuinely excited to take the case. But while I was building my legal case, I was discovering just how deep Sarah's betrayal went. I started reaching out to our mutual friends, expecting sympathy and support. Instead, I got this weird mix of awkwardness and outright hostility that caught me completely off guard. My buddy Dave from the auto shop, a guy I'd known for over 10 years, actually had the nerve to tell me I should just let Sarah have the house. According to him, she'd been through enough trauma thinking I was going to die, and now I was being selfish by coming back and disrupting her new life. The logic was so backwards it made my head spin. Even worse was my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, this sweet elderly lady who used to bring us cookies at Christmas. She pulled me aside at the grocery store and whispered that she thought Sarah was being very reasonable under the circumstances. Apparently, Sarah had been telling everyone that I was brain damaged and couldn't take care of myself anymore. The most painful conversation was with my own brother Kevin. He lived up in Seattle and hadn't visited while I was in the hospital, which should have been my first clue. When I called to tell him about Sarah's fraud, he sighed like I was bothering him with minor drama instead of telling him about my wife stealing our house. Kevin suggested that maybe Sarah had a point about my condition and that I should consider the possibility that I really wasn't capable of handling major financial decisions. He'd been talking to Sarah regularly throughout my hospital stay, and she convinced him that my injuries were affecting my judgment and memory. What really got me was how easily everyone believed her version of events. Sarah had played the role of the devoted wife so perfectly that people couldn't imagine she'd be capable of such calculated betrayal. Meanwhile, I was a guy who looked damaged, walking around on crutches, sometimes forgetting things because of pain medication. The social dynamics were fascinating in the worst possible way. Sarah had managed to position herself as a victim, the poor woman whose husband got hurt and wasn't the same person anymore. I was cast as a confused, possibly unstable husband who couldn't accept his new limitations. It was masterful manipulation, I'll give her that. But Jim the lawyer was making progress. He'd hired a handwriting expert who confirmed the signature was forged, and he'd tracked down the notary who swore he'd never seen me or the documents. More importantly, he'd subpoenaed my medical records, which clearly showed that I was mentally competent throughout my hospital stay. We also discovered that Sarah had opened 3 new credit cards in my name while I was unconscious, maxing them out on everything from a new wardrobe to expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been able to afford. She'd been living it up on the settlement money from my accident while I was learning to walk again. The paper trail was damning. Sarah had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. She'd researched how to forge signatures, found complicit notaries, and carefully constructed a narrative that would make her the sympathetic figure if anyone questioned her actions. This wasn't a desperate woman making bad decisions in a crisis. This was a calculated heist. What really burned me up was finding out about her new boyfriend. This wasn't some rebound relationship that developed after she thought I was going to die. Phone records showed they'd been talking regularly for almost a year before my accident. She'd been planning her exit from our marriage long, before that drunk driver gave her the perfect excuse. The boyfriend, whose name was Marcus, worked as a sales manager at a car dealership and made decent money. He drove a BMW, lived in a nice apartment complex with a pool, and apparently had been promising Sarah the kind of lifestyle my mechanic's salary could never provide. I wasn't just competing with another man. I was competing with a completely different economic bracket. Jim explained that this actually worked in our favor legally. If Sarah could prove she was just a grieving wife trying to survive, that would be one thing. But a woman who'd been planning to leave her husband and had used his accident as cover for financial fraud, that was a whole different story, and judges didn't look kindly on that kind of opportunism. The day of our first court hearing arrived 6 weeks later, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous. I'd never been involved in any legal proceedings more serious than a speeding ticket, and here I was about to face off against a woman I'd shared a bed with for 8 years. Jim had coached me on what to expect, but nothing really prepares you for seeing your wife walk into a courtroom ready to destroy you. Sarah showed up looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine, professional blazer, hair perfectly styled, just the right amount of makeup to look put together, but not overdone. She had this confidence about her that I'd never seen before, like she was completely certain she'd walk out of there with everything she wanted. Marcus, her boyfriend, was there too, sitting in the back row like some kind of moral support. Her lawyer was this expensive-looking guy in a suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. He had that slick, corporate attorney vibe that made me immediately distrust him. During his opening statement, he painted Sarah as a devoted wife who'd made difficult but necessary decisions while her husband was incapacitated and unable to manage his affairs. According to their version of events, I was mentally compromised from my injuries and medication, unable to make sound financial decisions, and Sarah had stepped in to prevent us from losing everything. They claimed the signature wasn't forged, that I'd signed the papers during one of my lucid moments, but couldn't remember due to my condition. Then came the character witnesses, and this part hurt more than any physical therapy I'd endured. Dave from the auto shop took the stand and testified that I seemed different since the accident, more forgetful and confused. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, said I'd been acting strangely when she'd seen me around the house, talking to myself and seeming disoriented. Even my own brother Kevin had flown in from Seattle to testify against me. He told the court that during our phone conversations, I'd seemed paranoid and accusatory, unable to accept that Sarah was just trying to help. He suggested that my injuries might have affected my ability to understand complex situations, and that Sarah was protecting both of us from my poor judgment. Watching these people I'd trusted throw me under the bus was surreal. They genuinely seemed to believe they were helping me by supporting Sarah's version of events. In their minds, I was a damaged man who couldn't see that his wife was sacrificing her own happiness to take care of him. It was gaslighting on a community level. But Jim was ready for all of this. When it was our turn, he methodically destroyed their narrative piece by piece. First came Dr. Rodriguez, my neurologist, who testified that my brain scan showed no damage whatsoever and that I'd been mentally sharp throughout my entire hospital stay. He had detailed notes proving my cognitive function was never impaired. Then Jim presented the handwriting analysis, which conclusively proved the signature was forged. The expert witness explained exactly how he could tell. The pressure points were wrong. The speed of writing was too consistent, and several letter formations were completely unlike my natural handwriting patterns. It was forensic evidence that couldn't be dismissed as opinion. The real knockout punch came when Jim called the private investigator he'd hired to track Sarah's activities. This guy had receipts, literally. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners with Marcus during the time she claimed she was devastated about my condition. Hotel receipts from weekend getaways while I was still in intensive care. Phone records showing hundreds of calls between them starting months before my accident. Sarah's face went white when investigators started reading dates and locations. Her expensive lawyer started shuffling papers frantically, probably realizing his client had lied to him about the timeline of her relationship. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, was taking notes with the kind of focus that suggested she was not impressed with what she was hearing. But the most devastating evidence was the medical power of attorney documents that Sarah claimed gave her the right to make financial decisions. Jim had discovered that these papers were filed 2 days after I'd already been discharged from the hospital and was living at a rehabilitation center, fully conscious and alert. The dates didn't match her story at all. During cross-examination, Sarah's composure finally started to crack. Jim asked her directly about the timeline of her relationship with Marcus, and she stumbled through answers that contradicted her earlier testimony. When he pressed her about specific dates and expenses, she claimed she couldn't remember, which was interesting since she'd had perfect recall about my supposed mental state. The most uncomfortable moment came when Jim asked her to explain why she told Tank Top Tony that I was dead when she was renting out our house. Sarah looked directly at me for the first time during the proceedings, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been shame. Or maybe it was just annoyance at getting caught. Marcus, sitting in the back, was looking increasingly uncomfortable as more details came out about their relationship and spending habits. I got the impression he hadn't signed up for this level of legal drama and public embarrassment. There's nothing quite like having your affair dissected in open court to make a relationship lose its romantic appeal. By the end of the day, even Sarah's expensive lawyer seemed to realize they were fighting a losing battle. During the recess, I saw him having what looked like a very serious conversation with Sarah and Marcus. From their body language, it wasn't going well. Jim was confident we'd proven our case, but he warned me that Sarah might try to negotiate a settlement to avoid the fraud charges that were looking increasingly likely. 3 weeks after the court hearing, Judge Martinez handed down her decision, and it was everything Jim had promised and more. The Ford signature was ruled invalid. The house sale was completely nullified, and Sarah was ordered to pay me back every cent she'd stolen, plus interest and legal fees. But the real cherry on top was the fraud charges the district attorney decided to pursue based on the evidence we presented. The financial judgment alone was substantial, almost $200,000 when you added up the settlement money she'd spent, the fraudulent credit card charges, and the damages. Combined with my original $500,000 settlement from the car accident, I was actually in better financial shape than I'd ever been in my life. It's funny how sometimes your worst day can end up leading to your best outcome. Sarah's fancy lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal to avoid jail time, but the DA wasn't having it. Apparently, she'd become a poster child for elder fraud, even though I wasn't elderly, just temporarily vulnerable. The case got picked up by local news stations as a cautionary tale about taking advantage of accident victims, which definitely didn't help Sarah's cause. Marcus, her boyfriend, disappeared from the picture about as fast as you'd expect. Turns out a BMW salesman doesn't stick around when his girlfriend becomes a convicted felon with massive debts and no assets. I heard through the grapevine that he'd started dating someone else within a month. Real solid relationship foundation they had there. The whole experience taught me a lot about people's true character. Dave from the auto shop actually had the decency to apologize once the court records became public. He admitted that Sarah had been feeding him a steady stream of lies about my condition, and he felt terrible about believing her over me. We're not as close as we used to be, but at least we're on speaking terms. My brother Kevin, on the other hand, doubled down on his original position. According to him, I was being vindictive by pursuing the fraud charges, and Sarah had suffered enough. We haven't spoken since the trial ended. Sometimes you discover that blood really isn't thicker than water, especially when that blood doesn't want to admit they were completely wrong. The physical recovery was actually easier than emotional recovery. My legs healed up better than the doctors expected, and I was back to working on cars within 6 months. But learning to trust people again, that took a lot longer. When someone that close to you can lie that convincingly for that long, it makes you question your judgment about everyone else. About 8 months after the trial, I was settling into my new routine, working at a different auto shop across town, living alone in my house that finally felt like mine again, even dating a little bit. That's when Sarah called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, less confident than the woman who'd walked into that courtroom ready to destroy me. She started with an apology, which would have meant more if it hadn't come after she'd exhausted all her legal options. Then came the sob story. She was broke, working at a diner for minimum wage, living in a studio apartment in the worst part of town. Marcus was long gone. Her friends had abandoned her after a fraud conviction, and she was having trouble finding decent work with a criminal record. The conversation that really got me was when she suggested we could start over. She claimed she'd learned her lesson, that losing everything had made her realize what really mattered. She even had the audacity to suggest that we were both victims of circumstances, her of grief and poor judgment, me of a tragic accident, like we were somehow equal participants in what had happened. I listened to the whole speech without interrupting, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because I wanted to see just how far she'd go. When she finished, there was this long silence on the line. I think she was actually expecting me to feel sorry for her, maybe even offer to help her get back on her feet. The delusion was almost impressive. My response was simple and final. I told her that she'd made her choice when she decided my accident was an opportunity instead of a tragedy. She'd chosen Marcus over me, money over loyalty, and lies over truth. The consequences she was dealing with weren't punishment. They were just a natural result of the choices she'd made. Then I hung up. A few weeks later, I ran into her at a grocery store in a different part of town. She was wearing a cheap uniform from some restaurant. Her hair looked like she'd cut it herself, and she was using food stamps to buy generic cereal and marked-down bread. When she saw me, she looked down and hurried away without making eye contact. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt genuinely at peace. These days, I'm doing pretty well. The settlement money is invested conservatively. I've got a house that's paid off, and I'm working because I want to, not because I have to. I'm even engaged to a wonderful woman named Lisa, who was my physical therapist during recovery. She knows the whole story and loves me anyway, which feels like a miracle some days. Sometimes people ask me if I'm bitter about what Sarah did, and honestly, I'm grateful, not for the pain and betrayal, but for the clarity. I learned exactly who I could count on when things got tough, and more importantly, I learned that I'm stronger than I ever thought possible. Some lessons are expensive, but the valuable ones usually are. And hey, at least I got a $500,000 education out of it. Hey, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me through this crazy story. I know it's a lot to process. I'm still processing it myself sometimes. What do you think? Have you ever had someone close to you show their true colors during a crisis? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. If this story helped you in any way, or if you just want to support the channel, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Your support means everything, and I love reading your comments and experiences. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember, sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up being exactly what we needed to become who we're supposed to be.